Hello and welcome everyone to episode number 2 of History Bytes. You will recall that in the opening episode, I made some general comments about the kind of journey that I wanted to take you through on the history of constitutions in Pakistan. So, first and foremost, I spoke about a different kind of analytical framework for thinking about constitutions and constitution making that was informed by and embedded within things like context, global politics, by which I meant intersections broadly of both the local context and global affairs, and historical knowledge, of course, because there is no substitute really for self knowing. And it's only when we begin to understand our historical contexts, transformations, and how the past actually influences the present that we really come to know about why constitutions really matter. Now, in the first episode, there was somebody who made a comment on my video about how constitutions had always been instrumentalized in Pakistan by powers that be, and particularly the military. And I want to take this particular theme forward, which is to say, I want to explore further the nexus between constitutions on the one hand and power on the other. So, shout out to the person who made that comment because it's given me a really excellent segue into talking about and interrogating power, which I think is a very central theme when we speak about constitutions and constitution making. There are several scholars today, in fact, there are some very dominant schools of constitutional thinking that tend to emphasize a very depoliticized vision of what constitutions and constitution making entail. By that, I mean the focus seems almost entirely to be fixated on things like formal rules, formal institutional structures like the assembly, its composition, so on and so forth. And I don't mean to suggest that those things or factors are not important. But this is really just to say that all those things are embedded within a particular context. Now, when we begin to look at constitutions through a contextual lens of power, we then really begin to tackle questions like why does the Constitution matter? Does it even matter? And if so, in what ways? Under what conditions? What are its potentialities? What are its limitations and constraints? How can we think of effective social and political action that can help us in enforcing the Constitution in ways that it was intended to be enforced?
I think the Constitution is just a piece of paper to be thrown in the dustbin.
Now, for those of you who lived through the times of General Pervez Musharraf, or at least are familiar with that recent history, would know that if the Constitution was indeed a piece of paper, President Musharraf would not have gone through all the acrobatics and all the social and political engineering that he did in order to recreate the Constitution in a way that suited his own political and power goals. Of course, General Pervez Musharraf is not the first military dictator to try and instrumentalize the constitution of Pakistan and to try and reclaim for the military a certain kind of constitutional legitimacy as the custodians of the country and the constitution itself. If anything, this sort of dynamic has been a core feature, if you will, of Pakistan's constitutional history from its inception in 1947. One very obvious example that I think all of us would be familiar with is that of General Ayub Khan, who claimed that he and he alone could give a constitution to the people of Pakistan that would match their genius. And then, of course, a lesser known example is that of General Yahya Khan, who was about to, in fact, introduce his own constitution in December 1971 at the exact moment when he was ousted from power. That constitution was interestingly crafted by none other than Justice Cornelius, one of the most celebrated judges of Pakistan.
My second phase of the plan, which is making of the constitution, I'll do my damnedest to bring it about. If it doesn't come about, martial law will have to continue. My duty then remains.
In fact, I think there is no better illustration of this power dynamic than what we see in the first Constituent Assembly of Pakistan that came into being in 1947 at the time of independence, and was dismissed by the Governor General in 1954. So think about it. The first Constituent Assembly of Pakistan never got to produce a constitution. That constitution, that we know as the 1956 Constitution, was created by a second Constituent Assembly. And most young people would probably believe that the 1956 Constitution was a democratic constitution, that it came about through a proper political consensus in the way that assemblies typically produce constitutions. This really couldn't be farther from the truth, because once the first Constituent Assembly was dismissed by the Governor General, and that particular action upheld as constitutional by the Federal Court of Pakistan, as it was known back then, it allowed other forces like the bureaucracy and the military to engineer a new assembly that would then produce a constitution that would not only centralize power but also concentrate it within bodies or institutions that were not representative of the people of Pakistan. But my crucial point is that this is not just a linear story of power. This is a long 7-year history of a power struggle where a number of forces were competing against each other. And not only that, they were also actively working to build alliances and coalitions, at times amongst forces that did not see eye to eye with each other but aligned for more politically expedient reasons. And there are stories in there about resistance and how coalition building is done for resistance against this kind of an onslaught. Those are the kinds of stories that are really crucial, that really help us understand the texture of power. Why do these collaborations happen? Why does resistance take place? And what are the conditions for that kind of resistance to be successful? That's the kind of unpacking of the constitution making process that really gives us a sense of how power flows through this system. It's not where does all of this lead us? I want to for now leave you with one final thought, which is that when you're trying to explore power through constitutions and constitution making, you must always think of competing forces because power has never really been stabilized in the context of Pakistan. Of course, we have the military, but we also have other state institutions that have at times acted in ways that don't entirely align with the military's interests and goals. So, take the judiciary, for example. Historically, the judiciary has collaborated several times, as we know, with military dictatorships, but there have also been moments, phases, and spaces of contestation and resistance. Same goes with social movements and social groups, which have at times collaborated with the military, at times stood in resistance to it. And, of course, let us not forget the political parties. They form the bedrock of how the Constitution, in fact, functions. The fact that these forces often compete with each other, but often form alliances that are very cross cutting in nature, tells you that the other flip side to understanding power in a top down way is to also understand it as a measure of, let's say, social cohesion or conversely, social polarization. In episode number 3, I hope to bring to you all a granular story of the first Constituent Assembly of Pakistan to explore further these different forms of power and how they compete against each other in the power struggle that defines constitutional politics in Pakistan.